Good evening, everybody. This is Jeff J. Brown on China Rising Radio Sinoland, and I am very pleased to have on the show tonight a gentleman living in Eritrea in Africa. His name is Thomas C. Mountain. How are you doing, Thomas?
Fine, thank you.
Can I call you Tom?
Yes.
Okay, great. Listen, I just wanted to let the fans out there know how I found out about you. You wrote a couple articles on Telesur, and I was just like blown away that this guy in Eritrea, who was apparently a Westerner, was living in a very mysterious and largely unknown country, writing for Telesur. And then I found out you do regular articles on Counterpunch, and I just became more and more interested in your writing and your work, and contacted you, and you agreed to come on to let us know about Eritrea, because most Westerners probably couldn't find it on a map, and it's a wonderful opportunity for us to learn about a country that many people call, the Cuba of Africa. We're going to find out if that's true or not. So anyway, just a little bit about you and why you're in Eritrea, what got you there, and then I'd like to start asking you about the country.
Well, I've got a background of over 30 years in matters African, particularly interested in the Horn of Africa, both in modern times and in ancient as well. In our lifetimes, in maybe the last 50 years, the only country that's really, in the sense I became an adult, that liberated itself through the armed struggle and developed a new society was Eritrea. I mean, Cuba in the 50s, but I was just a child. So in 1991, Eritrea was born out of the armed struggle for national liberation. They were colonized by the Italians and then the British and then the Ethiopians. They defeated the Ethiopian army and liberated themselves. The only country in Africa where the government came to power through the armed struggle, a mass people's movement rose up and defeated the colonializers and liberated themselves. The rest of Africa, they came to power through negotiations and elections, and the result was neo-colonialism.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Eritrea always was something that I've been following. Since 1983, I was introduced to my first representative I met of the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, or EPLF, by an old friend of mine named Kwame Ture, otherwise known as Toko Carmichael. And Kwame Ture introduced me to them.
Wow.
And then I followed the struggle closely until 1991, and then in 91, after independence, all the Eritreans I knew in the United States moved back to Eritrea. So I kind of lost track of the struggle until 1998, when the Ethiopians launched a new effort to colonize Eritrea, the armed aggression against Eritrea. War broke out. It was quite confusing because I didn't really have a source to explain to me what was going on. The two parties involved, the Ethiopian government and the Eritrean government, had both been allies in the struggle to overthrow the Mengistu regime in Ethiopia. So why they ended up fighting each other was something that led me to London, where I met my wife, who was an ex-fighter from the armed struggle, who was there for medical treatment. And, so we ended up getting married, and I've been taking care of my elderly parents, and when they passed away, we moved to Eritrea in 2006. So I've been here over 10 years now, and it's very difficult to even think about going back to the U.S.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, I live in China, of course, and we're going home this summer, and it's going to be hard. It's difficult once you get outside of the what I call the Great Western Firewall. It's really hard. It's really hard to go back. Now, you mentioned, I know that Italy brutally colonized Ethiopia and Eritrea, and then the Brits did for a little while, I think, right after World War II, and then Ethiopia, the U.S., Ethiopia became kind of a U.S. colony post, as you said, neoliberal or neo-colonial colony. And then the crazy thing is with Mengistu, he went with the USSR, and can you just explain to us why the Eritreans, You know, I mean, they fought both the United States and the USSR.
Well, yeah. See, a little background. Actually, Eritrea is a very ancient civilization. Was here in the Horn of Africa. It's called the land of Punt, or land of Punt, land of the gods. It's in the Bible, and it's in the ancient Egyptian texts going back to the 5th dynasty, and it's been proven that Eritrea is actually what was the homeland of Punt. And this is, the Egyptians called it Punt, land of the gods. So it's very ancient and very sacred to the Egyptians in the Nile Valley. So there's been a long history of the Eritrean civilization. And but it went through some periods when they were invaded from Ethiopia, and then later when the rise of Islam cut them off from trade with outside countries. But it used to be the Greeks and the Romans, when in trading with India and China, all had to pass down the Red Sea. Their commerce passed to the Red Sea, and they passed through Punt. So it was actually quite a very wealthy country, but now it's like a lost civilization. But in any case, in the late 1800s, the Italians were the last European colonial power to come into Africa.
Yeah.
Italy wasn't even a country till Garibaldi united the country. So they were kind of left with the leftovers that nobody really wanted, the poor parts of Africa, the desert parts, like Libya, like the Horn of Africa, Somalia. And so the Italians arrived here about 1880. They colonized the country and gradually developed Eritrea into actually quite a modern country. Eritrea had, by 1938, when World War II broke out, Eritrea had the second largest GDP in Africa after South Africa. So Eritrea was quite developed by the Italians. Then the Italians were defeated by the British in 1941 in Africa, and the British took over Eritrea. Excuse me. And the British set about deliberately destroying all the industry that had been built up in Eritrea, including the United States had their light repair shops for the Indian Ocean Fleet in Eritrea in the port of Massawa. So after World War II, the British were supposed to let Eritrea become independent. But at the United States' intervention, the British turned Eritrea basically over to the control of the Ethiopians. Now, Eritrea was colonized for some 60 years by the Italians, and in 1936, Italy invaded Ethiopia as well and colonized Ethiopia, which is something that people don't seem to realize outside. There's a lot of propaganda about Haile Selassie and how Ethiopia was never colonized. They were colonized, completely colonized. The first national telephone network, the first national telegraph network, the first national road and railroad network built in Ethiopia were built by the Italians. So for 5 years, the Italians colonized Ethiopia till they were defeated by the British, and the British basically reinstalled Haile Selassie in power. Haile Selassie been hiding out in Britain. So after the war, the United States decided that, being that the Red Sea was very strategically important, the Suez Canal, the trade between Asia and Europe was passing through the Red Sea, and that the United States, said that Eritrea was very strategically important, critically strategically important, and it was in the United States' interest, national interest, for Eritrea to become part of Ethiopia, which the United States sort of seen as a bulwark against radical Islam, radical Arab nationalism in the region. So
because
Ethiopia violation of all the international law.
Because Ethiopia is a Christian, largely Christian country, right?
Well, that's a big propaganda. Actually, the majority of Ethiopians are Muslims.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Christians are actually a minority.
Okay.
But Haile Selassie you see, Ethiopia was actually an imperial power in Africa. It wasn't only the Europeans that colonized Africans. The Ethiopians in the late 1800s, with military support from the Italians, who they later turned on, colonized one of the largest, most powerful people in Africa, who called the Oromo people. And they make up about 40% of Ethiopia today. It took the Ethiopians about 20 years under the Christian leadership of the Ethiopians, the Amhara people, were known as the Abyssinians, to actually militarily defeat the Oromos. The Oromos were famous for their cavalry and their bravery in combat, but eventually modern arms from the Italians versus spears and arrows from the Roman cavalry. The Romans were defeated and colonized in very brutal colonization. It was almost a genocide. Millions and millions of the Romans were exterminated by the Ethiopian Christians. The Romans were basically a traditional animist religion, and gradually Islam became the dominant religion among the Romans. But Ethiopia colonized a lot of other peoples, and so Ethiopia was actually an empire. It wasn't a country. The Amhara are an ethnic minority group, and but they were Christian, ethnically minority, religious minority, but they were supported initially by the Western powers and then later by the British, and then by the Americans. So Haile Selassie, before him, his grandfather Menelik, they were Christians that were colonizing animist and Muslim peoples, and so Ethiopia was a pretty brutal dictatorship, and it was an empire. So the Ethiopian Empire was invaded by the Italian Empire and subjugated by them, and then reestablished by the British after World War II, and then the Americans gave Eritrea, who had the only access to the Red Sea. Ethiopia was basically landlocked and always wanted its own port. So the British and Americans gave Ethiopia access to the Red Sea by giving them Eritrea. And of course, Eritrea was actually quite advanced industrially and had been built up quite a bit by the Italians, had large agriculture and modern industry there. So, because of the critical nature of the Red Sea in terms of the Suez Canal and the trade between the Europe and Asia, the Americans have always been very concerned about who controls the ports and the waterways in the Red Sea. So the Americans have been involved in a lot of mischief and nastiness here. The Eritreans finally got fed up with the way they had been treated by the Ethiopians. Ethiopians came in and forced all the Eritreans to use the Ethiopian language, the Amhara language, in their schools and their government work. And first it was Haile Selassie, and then when Haile Selassie was overthrown by a military coup during the Great Drought in 1974, it was again, it was just a change in government, but the oppression of the Eritrean people continued. Actually, Eritrea is not all the same people. Actually, there are 9 tribes. And Eritrea is half Christian and half Muslim, almost equal.
Huh.
So Eritrea is unique that way. Muslims and Christians get along here. I mean, the people had a long bit of experience of the British and other people trying to use religion to divide the people.
Yeah, divide and conquer.
People in their struggle for independence, yes, in the struggle for independence, the people became very conscious of the need not to let outsiders come in and use religion to divide us. So in 1961, the Eritreans launched the armed struggle for national liberation against the Ethiopians. And over a series of years and some very desperate guerrilla wars against the Ethiopians, finally the tide turned, and in 1988, in a major battle called Afabit, which was one of the greatest military victories in history. The British historian Basil Davidson was there, and he said Afabit was Africa's Dien Bien Phu, referring to the Vietnamese victory over the French in 1954. So, this was the first armed struggle for national liberation that was victorious. They had other armed struggles like in Zimbabwe and other countries, Mozambique, but basically when it came down to it, there were negotiations that ended the armed struggle, and the governments came to power via neo-colonial elections, like in Zimbabwe and Angola and Mozambique and other countries. So Eritrea is the only country where the rebels, the liberation movement, militarily defeated their colonial occupiers and drove them out of the country and took over at the point of a gun. That's why when I say Eritrea is the Cuba of Africa, Cuba is the only country in South America where the government came to power through the armed struggle. All the rest of these countries came to power. They basically were granted independence by the colonizers, whereas in Cuba, under Castro's leadership, the Cuban people drove the colonizing or the dictatorship Batista out of the country, where he was a puppet for the U.S., and liberated the country at gunpoint. So that's what makes Eritrea and Cuba similar. And both countries are socialist countries, meaning that both countries, for example, both countries, the government owns all the land. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't own your own house and other things like that, but a house is something you create. Land, you didn't create that. Land has always been here. So why should why do you have the right to own the land that you didn't have anything to do with its creation? You create a house, you can create an orchard, a fruit orchard, there's a lot of things you can create that you can own, but to own the land is something that in a socialist country, and this is a very important point to define a really genuinely socialist country, is that the government owns land, and land itself cannot be bought and sold.
Yeah,
you can buy and sell your house, you can sell your car, you can sell an apple orchard, but once that apple orchard goes old and dies, you can't just sell the land. The land is yours to use, but if you're not using it, somebody else has the right to use it. It's not yours. You don't own the land. So that's socialism, and it's a defining principle. Eritrea, they sort of inherited, the Mengistu regime that was in control in Ethiopia from 1974, was an ally of the Soviet Union, claimed it was a socialist country, and they nationalized most of the large and medium-sized industries, not only in Ethiopia but in Eritrea too. So when the Eritreans, the EPLF, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, came to power in 1991, they basically inherited a country economy that had been in what you could call socialized, meaning that most of everything had been nationalized, was owned by the government. Now the government here, it's been trying. It tried to privatize, but there's such a system of corruption and endemic within the society that it was very difficult to get the private sector to step up to the plate and actually develop the country under the private sector, because it's all been all this corruption and nepotism and that was still sort of the culture among the business community. So the government sort of had to take over and try to revive the economy. Now, the fact that Eritrea came to power by the armed struggle, which is an anathema to the United States. I mean, that's the big thing. It's like about Cuba. Oh, they don't have elections. Because elections is something where you can buy, rig, or steal an election.
Yeah.
But when you come to power to the armed struggle, you can't buy, rig, or steal control of the government. It's a people's government, supported by the people. So the United States historically has hated Eritrea because they came to power by the armed struggle, just like Cuba. So Eritrea was independent for only 7 years when, through the instigation of the United States, the Ethiopians launched a new war of aggression to try to recolonize Eritrea. The United States promised them, they'd have access to the sea, to the Eritrean ports. And over a series of 3 years and a series of major battles, 1998, the Ethiopians invaded and were destroyed by the Eritrean army. And in 1999, they tried again and were destroyed. And in 2000, after an unprecedented military buildup and over $1 billion in Western-funded arms, the Ethiopians, with U.S. satellite intel and a lot of aid and support, the Ethiopians made some major headway in invading Eritrea. But eventually they were defeated by the Eritreans, and they're forced to withdraw. And since then, there's been a sort of a state of no war, no peace since 2000. And there was a final and supposedly final and binding peace treaty signed, border demarcation, which both sides had to accept. The pretext of the Ethiopians invading Eritrea was supposedly a border dispute, which the Ethiopians themselves pretty much admitted that was all baloney. But when the border commission that the UN set up finally issued the border demarcation, the so-called disputed border territories, which under the colonial borders had been part of Eritrea, were granted to Eritrea. And Ethiopians refused to accept this, and in spite of a supposedly final and binding peace agreement that the UN had promised they would invoke Article Chapter 7 and do all kind of punishing things to Ethiopia for breaking this peace deal they had promised to honor, Ethiopians have continued to occupy sovereign Eritrean territory and maintain a large army on the Eritrean border, and have consistently attacked Eritrea across the border in division-sized attacks, the last being in June of 2016, where over 10,000 Ethiopian troops came across the border. So Eritrea is only a small country, maybe 4 million people. Ethiopia is, 80, 90, maybe 100 million people by now, 20 times the size of Eritrea or more. So, Eritrea is poor, is economically destroyed by the 30 years of Ethiopian, 40 years of Ethiopian colonization and the 30-year war. and Eritrea is recovering from all this. Now, on top of that, we've been facing this, what I call climate disaster, not climate change. But there's been a series of record-breaking droughts hitting the Horn of Africa and Eritrea in particular. In 2003, 2004, just a couple or 3 years after the Ethiopian invasion, and during the Ethiopian invasion in 2000, when they successfully broke through the Eritrean defenses and the Eritreans had to withdraw into the highlands where they destroyed the Ethiopian army, the Ethiopians created 1.5 million Eritrean refugees, about 40% of the country, had to force to flee their home, and left with just the clothes on their back. And the Eritrean government had to, rehouse, feed, and take care of all these people, and then, move them back to their homes and help them rebuild. And then 3 years later, in 2003, Eritrea was hit by the first 2-year back-to-back drought in history. There's never been 2 years in a row where the rains failed. And because the country is primarily an agricultural country, 70% of the people make their living off of agriculture, and they've been dependent on the annual rainfalls. And when the rains failed 2 years in a row, it never happened before. The Eritrean government had to feed all the Eritrean people. So this was a big disaster. It was a climate disaster, something that basically the Western countries are the primary cause of.
Yeah.
And yet the Eritrean people in the Horn of Africa are suffering from. So 2003, 2004, they had back-to-back droughts. Again, in 2008, 2009, there were back-to-back droughts.
Oh, my
and
gosh.
Then, in 2013, there was drought. In 2015, there was drought. So half of the time in the last 12, 13 years, there's been drought here. So this has forced the government to, face up to the fact that climate change is real. It's not something that we can debate about. It's just been hammering us out here. And in our neighbors, there's been massive famine. I mean, in 2010, 2011, 2012, for example, in Somalia and in southeastern Ethiopia, there was what was then called the Great Horn of Africa drought, which in Somalia alone, the UN admitted at least 250,000, many children starved to death. 250,000 people starved to death. Does the world even know this? In Somalia.
Yeah.
That doesn't even include Ethiopia, where a lot of people starved to death, but no Western journalists are even allowed in there. So,
hey, listen, let me ask you, I want to confirm, you talked about Eritrea being an ancient culture, and you talked about the land of the Punt or the Punt. Can you spell that, please, for our fans out there?
P-U-N-T, Punt. P-U-N-T.
Okay.
Punt, like Punt.
Okay.
P-U-N-T, and it was always referred to by the ancient Egyptians of the Nile Valley, not as Punt, but Punt, land of the gods. So whether the gods of Eritrea came out of Punt into Egypt or what, but it was considered very sacred. The Egyptian pharaoh was actually a queen. Hatshepsut sent an expedition to Eritrea in the 18th dynasty, and it helped legitimize herself as the ruler of Egypt because the Punt was considered so sacred that sending an expedition there and bringing back the sacred items from Punt it helped legitimize her rule as a woman in Egypt. So it's an ancient civilization.
And then you mentioned that we don't have your I'm understanding you, but words that we don't recognize, I'm having a hard time spelling. How do you spell the tribe of people that the Ethiopians conquered?
Oromos, O-R-O-M-O, Oromo. Oromo is the second largest language in Africa, and the Oromos are actually the largest single contiguous people in Africa.
Wow.
40 million people sharing the same language and the same culture, and they are an unknown people. Second largest language, actually the largest nation in Ethiopia, in Africa, with a single language. So
O-R-O-M-O, Oromo.
Yes. And the Oromos have actually been the center of the uprising that took place last year in Ethiopia, where the Amhara actually were part of it as well. But the Oromos in particular, for the first time in many, many years have risen up and refused to accept the boot of oppression on their necks by the Ethiopian regime, the Western-funded and backed Ethiopian regime. And so now Ethiopia is in a state of continuing national state of emergency, where there's once again, there's basically no internet in almost the entire country. The cell phone service in almost the whole country has been cut off, other than just maybe you can call within your town or your district. So there's the state of emergency. There's many thousands, maybe as much as 20,000 people locked up in prisons, and massive repression going on in the country. So Ethiopia is in the midst of a big revolution, and another major explosion is just brewing for the time being. But yet everybody talks about how bad Eritrea is. But our streets are peaceful. Our police here don't even carry firearms, and you can hardly find a policeman. And when you do, they're not even armed. They're just walking the streets, not even about them. They're just basically traffic police.
And you mentioned...
Yet they call us a police state.
Yeah, I know. It's typical Western propaganda for any country that's independent. They say the same thing about China. You mentioned the battle, a famous battle where the Eritreans won. 1988. What was that battle? Can you spell that?
It's called Afabet, A-F-A-B-E-T, Afabet. It was the turning point in the Eritrean War. They defeated an army of 250,000 Ethiopian soldiers were basically wiped out, destroyed, and forced to retreat for their lives. So that was a turning point in the Eritrean struggle for national liberation.
Afabet.
In 91, they finally liberated Afabet, yeah. Basil Davidson, the famous African historian, was actually in Eritrea with the rebels, doing a documentary on their struggle, and actually witnessed by accident, witnessed the battle firsthand. And like I said, he called it the Dien Bien Phu of Africa. So
like
it was a big turning point.
The French in Vietnam.
Yep, it's just like it was actually at that point. It was the major turning point and the only successful armed struggle in African history, modern African history. So it's pretty. To me, it's a pretty significant point in African history. Something that most people have never heard of, but it's like I was talking about the droughts that were hammering us.
Yeah.
That you continue to hammer us. In 2015, we had another drought. I mean, it's like the government's instituted a major policy of water conservation, where they've taken the scarce resources that we have and put them into building massive water reservoirs all across the country, and storing water and using it to irrigate, to try to break the cycle of dependency on the rains, because we've had 2-year droughts. We could be heading into 5-year droughts. And, our neighbors are all starving. I mean, Somalia, Ethiopia, South Sudan, is major starvation in these countries. Hundreds of thousands of people dying of starvation. No one's dying of starvation in Eritrea. The same drought's been hammering us. So we're a socialist country.
Yeah, exactly. I just also wanted to point out, you mentioned that Eritrea, why it's compared to Cuba, because it won a socialist / communist, revolution at the point of a gun and was able to actually maintain that revolution. I'd also like to say that China was another country that did the same thing. Mao and the communists drove out the Japanese,
yeah, China,
the KMT,
Vietnam,
and then of course all the Western imperialists. They were all driven out. So can we say that for like healthcare, housing, education, is it very similar to Cuba? I mean, healthcare for all, housing is available.
Yes, it's similarities with Cuba. We have free national education up to the university, to graduate level, basically free national health care, and so the government's working on housing. The scarce resources. I mean, with the droughts and the invasion of the war and the sanctions that the Americans forced through the UN Security Council in Eritrea, completely false sanctions in 2009, claiming Eritrea was supporting terrorism in Somalia.
Yeah, Somalia. I remember reading about that.
Yeah, well, we know from WikiLeaks that this is a complete fabrication. The Americans passed these sanctions knowing full well that Eritrea wasn't involved with the Somalis, and that the reason they passed the sanctions was Eritrea was about to start its first mine in the mining industry, which is going to help transform our economy. And the point was to sabotage the financing for the mining industry, the first mine in Eritrea, the gold mine called Bisha. So this is all WikiLeaks. We know this is all fabrication. Eritrea does not support terrorism, just like Cuba never supported terrorism. The Americans put sanctions on Cuba for decades and still have sanctions on Cuba based with the false claims that that Cuba supported terrorism when, in fact, the Americans are supporting terrorism against Cuba. So,
of course.
I think just like the Americans did terroristic things against China and in North Korea after World War II, where they were sending people, even bringing in infected rats and other things with bubonic plague to try to destabilize the country. So we've been through the same thing. We've been under sanctions of the UN since 2009. So all this has been damaging our economy, along with these massive climate disasters been hammering us. But the governments refuse to, Eritrea does not owe any money to the World Bank or the IMF. We're the only country in Africa that's not in debt to the IMF or the World Bank.
Well, thank God, because it would be like a vampire squid and come in and
the
seize
government knows
everything.
And Eritrea has the lowest per capita debt in Africa. So the government has refused to borrow money. They refuse to let the Western bankers control our economies, and they've been doing it on our own. So it's been difficult. And, it's been a challenge. It's not easy. The lives of the people here, just like in Cuba, is not easy. It's not easy to be independent and to develop your economy based on your own efforts. Well, without the Western bankers coming in and taking over. So, but the government's been making great strides in healthcare. Eritrea has reduced malaria mortality by 80%. It's the biggest breakthrough in malaria mortality in history. It's something nobody knows about, and it's basically done through a barefoot doctors program.
Like the Chinese.
They brought in these they've introduced insecticide-treated mosquito nets throughout the country. The problem is, after 3 months, the insecticide wears off, and if you've ever slept on a mosquito net, eventually you're going to roll up against the net and the mosquito's going to bite you, unless it's treated with insecticide. So the government's to have a program where every 3 months they get everybody to come in and retreat their mosquito nets. So, the World Bank come in and give out millions of mosquito nets, and 3 months later they're no longer really effective. Well, here in Eritrea, they continue to monitor the mosquito net program. Everyone lives in the malaria belt in the western lowlands is within a 2-hour walk of a medical clinic where they can get tested for what kind of malaria they have and get the right kind of medicine. So they reduced malaria mortality by 80%.
Wow.
And it's something the World Health Organization refuses to recognize. For example, in HIV infection rate, Eritrea has reduced HIV infection rates by 40%, the largest infection rate reduction of HIV in Africa. We have the lowest HIV infection rate, below 2% in Africa. So big, and it's basically done through a condom campaign, public use of condom campaign. And we're a very conservative country, half traditional Christians, Orthodox Christians, very conservative, half Muslims, very conservative, socially conservative. And yet, by pushing this condom campaign, they've gotten HIV, AIDS under control. We've got the thing about Eritrea is most of the people live out in the villages. So the government's first concern, being a socialist country, is to take care of the poorest people first.
Yeah.
So if you're living in the city, we haven't really seen much change in the city. But if you go out to the village, we see this dramatic breakthroughs in villages. You see solar-powered wells. People used to have to carry water by donkeys for miles. Now you've got solar-powered wells in the middle of the village. Eritrea's got the second per capita, the second highest rate of solar use in the world after Germany. So you've got solar-powered water wells, you've got solar-powered schools, you've got solar-powered medical clinics way out in these far, far villages, far, far away. It takes hours by car to get there. You get there, you find a school with computers. You find wells in the middle of where people can just come and get clean drinking water. So these are big breakthroughs in the villages, but that's been the first concern. Socialist country, you take care of your poorest people, your most needy people first. And so, we've seen a lot of young people leaving the country because, like we've got 500,000 Ethiopians on our border. So, you know, if we show any sign of weakness, and the Ethiopians are constantly sending large division-sized armies across the border every year or two to test us. We have to keep our young people in the trenches on the border. And some of these places are 40, you know, it's 40 centigrade, and there's malaria out there, and our young people have been there since 2000. I mean, 15, 16, 17 years. And so their life there is hard when nobody wants our children to be out in the trenches, but we don't have a choice. Ethiopia wants to reinvade us. And so, you know, our young people get fed up with it. But interestingly enough, most of the young people from the villages have stuck it out because they've seen big changes in their lives of their families. But it's the young people from the city, the ones that are used to the internet and the smartphones, and they're the ones that, you know, they get seduced by the dreams of satellite TV. That just, you know, you find gold in the streets and money on the trees, and they you know, they've been going outside. And interestingly enough, like last summer, I was outside in Germany, and I got a chance to go around to some of the refugee centers in Germany. And these Eritreans, they really regret leaving home. But, you know, they've gone through these life-threatening experiences, going through Libya and ISIS and Daesh and all these, you know, going out into the middle of the Mediterranean and seeing their friends drown out there, you know, and they're being kidnapped and families forced to sell everything they own to pay their ransoms. And when they get to Europe, you know, they regret it. But, you know, it's like they've got to try to make some money to help their families because life is hard here, you know, and the country is still very dependent on the Eritreans living outside to send money home to fund the country. Well, Eritrea and the United States are the only two countries in the world that have an income tax on their citizens living abroad. I mean, I'm an American citizen still, and I'm eligible. I'm supposed to pay up to 30% of my income, you know, anything I earn outside the American government. Well, the Eritrean government requires all Eritreans living outside to pay a 2% tax. So you pay a 2% tax, and that it amounts to about $400 million a year. And this money goes to, you know, because our government here is basically corruption-free. I mean, I can't say there's no corruption, but, you know, in compared to the rest of the third world, the corruption level is extremely low here. The money that people pay in income taxes to the government goes to help their families, and they know that's why people pay. So, I mean, you know, the free schools, the free education, the free medical care, much of this is funded by the Eritreans living outside, working hard, and paying their 2% tax. So, you know, but life is hard here. I don't pretend otherwise. I mean, it's not like we're a rich country. It's not like we've been hammered by drought. We're still an agricultural country. To see the rains fail and to see people, you know, just basically have nothing after a year of hard work and planting, and then the crops don't come up because there's no rain. I mean, this is, you know, the government's working hard to transform the economy into a modern, irrigation-based agricultural economy. But this takes infrastructure, and infrastructure is very expensive. So, you know, but we're working hard on it, and you see the big changes if you get out of the city. But, like, you know, we're talking on the phone instead of doing Skype because, you know, having clean drinking water is more of a priority for the Eritrean government than having a high-speed internet. So, you know, some of us who are kind of spoiled from the outside, we tend to want to, you know, miss some of the things from outside. No Netflix in Eritrea, you know what I mean? So,
Tom, so it sounds like Eritrea. The Eritreans have a bit of the North Korean, you know, the self-reliance, the juche. They don't want the World Bank and the IMF, and they want to be able to do it on their own, which is very commendable. And of course, the Cubans basically had it because they were completely sealed off by the United States. I wanted to ask you, and they still are, basically. It's a little bit better, but not much.
Still sanctions against Cuba. None of the sanctions have been lifted.
Yeah. Is the West, you know, for our fans out there, under Obama, Bush, George W. Bush, going back to Clinton, and now Trump, the White House has about 135 secret armies or private armies, groups of 6 to 20, 25 men, basically assassins, saboteurs, etc. Most of them are in Africa. They have calculated that They are committing 1.5 attacks a day in Africa, over 500 a year. And obviously this is to destabilize governments and create false flags and create terror in the minds of the people and destabilize governments that they want to be able to manipulate and control. Do you think that any of those secret armies are in Eritrea?
Well, no. The one thing the government here is very good at is security, and the streets are safe. Like our police don't even have to be armed. It's so safe. We just had Independence Day, May 24th, where hundreds of thousands of our youth were out dancing and partying in the streets, and no incidents at all. No reports of any robberies or anything. It's very disciplined, very safe country, very secure. And, in spite of the fact that the American State Department says, don't come to Eritrea, it's too dangerous, I have seen the U.S. Consul, who is basically the senior U.S. diplomat in the country, twice now, white women, walking the streets at dusk and back quiet side streets without any bodyguards. The rest of Africa, they ride around in bulletproof Land Cruisers with automatic weapons. These are white women walking all by themselves on a quiet back street. So that's how safe our country is. Because the government is, we came to power through the armed struggle. That people are very disciplined. All our youth go through military training, and we have this threat of the Ethiopians attacking us. So, but I just kind of want to clarify something about AFRICOM. When you come down to the total number of troops in Africa, the French actually have much more troops and military equipment in Africa. I mean, there are active French invasionary forces in Mali and Central African Republic,
many of
in
them.
Cote d'Ivoire. Yes, and the French are actually much more involved militarily in Africa. But the Americans are involved here. But the one place you never hear about American military involvement is Ethiopia. And Ethiopia is the largest recipient of American and Western aid in Africa. The Ethiopian army is the largest, best-equipped army in Africa, paid for by Western aid. And Ethiopia actually has a very active African command contingent in Ethiopia, which we never hear about. They announced at one point that we knew that they had a drone base in Ethiopia, and they said they shut it down, but there are still active drones in Ethiopia. And when the Ethiopians attacked Eritrea in June 2016, the American military is directly involved in it.
Yeah.
So it's something nobody ever talks about. And I have to warn your listeners that, you got to be careful of people like Jeremy Scahill and the people at The Intercept, and especially Nick Turse. Nick Turse has written all these supposedly award-winning articles, and he's never once pointed out the major involvement the CIA is doing in Africa right now is in South Sudan. The South Sudanese rebellion is being funded by the CIA.
Well, of course.
To the tune of over $300 million. There's no visible means of support for these rebels. And the main goal of the rebels is to drive the Chinese out of the only Chinese oil fields in Africa, in South Sudan. So, these rebels are being funded by the CIA, and not a word about any of these so-called award-winning journalists about this. In other words, they make it into like African black-on-black tribal violence, and this is just Africans or animals. No, it's not. This is a Western instigated rebellion that's being for the purpose of defending U.S. national interests and controlling African energy, depriving China of access to African energy, and not a word of this anywhere in the Western media. Jeremy Scahill, supposedly an award-winning journalist for The Intercept, he landed in Mogadishu, Somalia in June of 2011 in the midst of what was then the Great Horn of African drought, where 250,000 Somali children died. And within a few miles of the hotels he was staying in, hundreds of people were dying every day, and never once wrote about it. Instead, he wrote about CIA secret bases and drones and an assassination campaign where a few hundred people have been killed, while 250,000 people were starving to death. And if he'd have broken that story, maybe the world would have been forced to come in and feed these hundreds of thousands of children that died, and they could have prevented. But no. They like to write sexy stories. When they really come down to it, they miss all the big stories. They miss the CIA-funded rebellion in South Sudan. They miss the AFRICOM's major involvement in Ethiopia and attacking Eritrea. A lot of times these stories they write are smokescreens.
Of course.
And they kind of divert people's attention. They're diverting people's attention where the real problems are. And we've got a serious problem in Ethiopia. This is one of Africa's largest countries on the verge of collapse. Another explosion and collapse. And the Americans are in there propping up this regime. and they're threatening these regimes, attacking their neighbors. They've invaded Somalia. I mean, Al-Shabaab was created by the Ethiopian invasion in 2006. There was no Al-Shabaab before that. They were the youth arm of the Union of Islamic Courts. And the Americans sent the Ethiopians to invade, to drive a progressive, nationalist Islamic government out of power of Somalia, and created this monster called Al-Shabaab. I mean, this is where you see terrorism, you see the Americans behind it.
Yeah. Well, Tom, that's just like Nigeria. I mean, Boko Haram was just a small gang of thugs. And as soon as China signed ink contracts to build 3 oil refineries in Nigeria and develop develop upstream processing capabilities for Nigeria, all of a sudden, Boko Haram is, coming over the hills, with, tens of millions of dollars worth of equipment and
Libyan arms. Arms from Libya.
Yeah, Libya.
That was destroyed by the basic West.
And so it's to destabilize Nigeria because the United States can't stand the thought of the Chinese helping the Nigerians actually refine gasoline and kerosene and export it instead of having to instead of having to import gasoline and kerosene from the West and export their oil. So I mean, everywhere, even Libya. I mean, one of the great, one of the reasons that they sacked and destroyed Libya is because China had $20 billion worth of investments there. 35,000 Chinese were there helping build canals and roads and railroads and housing and Libya was a socialist paradise, and everywhere the Chinese go in Africa, the United States and NATO are right there to try to destroy their cooperation with these countries. So it's just awful. I wanted to ask you: is Eritrea? Is it really like the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, where they have the Juche total self-reliance, or are there NGOs in Eritrea, or does Eritrea know that most of the Western ones are CIA?
Yeah, the Eritrea actually kicked most of the NGOs out back in 2002 because when you come down to NGOs, I call them no good outfits because basically they take 80% of the money that's supposed to go to help Eritrea that they raise and pay themselves fat salaries with it.
Yeah.
So Eritrea is basically, they kicked most of the NGOs out of the country, and they kicked USAID and all these CIA front groups. They kicked them out. We do have some UNICEF work here. The UN does have some presence here, but very little. Most of this is, China's got a very positive aid program to Eritrea, and Eritrea is always looking for help to make itself more self-reliant. And so they don't turn down help from outside, but it has to be help that's aimed at making Eritrea more self-sufficient.
Yeah.
They don't want to become a debtor nation. They don't want to become under the control of these Western banksters or anybody. So, Eritrea, and all the loans that Eritrea has taken out have been all long-term, lower interest-free loans. So they're not strapped into a debt repayment problem. And like I said, they have kicked the NGOs out. So we really don't see NGOs around here too much. A few UN people, but that's about it.
Speaking of, so you say China has an aid program. Are there any other socialist?
Well, China's also investing here. China's investing in the mining industry here. China helped Eritrea build its large cement factory. China's come in and helped put the communication infrastructure in. So China's been a friend of Eritrea, like it's been a friend in Africa. China's come in as partners, not as exploiters. One thing interesting about Eritrea, for example, Eritrea is developing its mining industry in the last 5 or 6 years, new mining industry here, gold, copper, and other things. Now, Eritrea, one of the largest gold mines in the world is owned by Anglo-American in Tanzania, and they pay the Tanzanian government a 4% royalty. Okay, 4%.
It's criminal.
And Eritrea gets 40% because Eritrea has invested in their own 30% stake in their own mining industries on top of their 10% royalty. So, if you're a Western company and you're making a fortune exploiting African resources, and you see Eritrea getting 4% and you've been getting, and you've only been paying 4% in Tanzania and the other countries, Eritrea is a threat because the rest of the African people are starting to say, hey, wait a second, how come we're only getting 4% and Eritrea's getting 40%? You see? So that's why, there's another reason why the West hates Eritrea, because we're self-reliant and we won't let people come in and just rip us off.
That's why. Well, that's why they took down Libya, because it was a Pan-African socialist paradise.
Yeah, well, Libya was also about to fund a major infrastructure, the African Bank, African Investment Bank, with $40 billion that the Americans have basically ripped off, and they were going to be, putting in a lot of infrastructure and making it basically interest-free loans to African countries, so they would no longer have to borrow from the World Bank and the IMF.
Yeah, they also were going to start.
That's another reason why they had to wipe them.
Yeah, and the gold dinar. They were going to have a gold-backed dinar. The 200 metric tons of gold that the Libyan government had to back their new gold dinar. That all got stolen and sent to Europe.
Libya and Eritrea had quite close. Libya was actually a good friend of Eritrea after independence too. So, it was kind of a blow when Libya fell here. But the government's very resilient here. So, we've been able to go ahead and continue to. But one of the things I'd like to point out is that climate disaster is scientifically proven to be first hammering the equatorial regions, and then gradually it'll reach up to the northern regions. And so the Horn of Africa has been the front lines of the climate disasters going back into the 80s, the Great Horn of African drought that Michael Jackson made so famous with "We Are the World." I mean, this is not something new to us. We've been getting hammered for decades now, and only the rest of the world is catching on. But I remember 10 years ago, the leading climatologists were saying that by the end of the century, the polar sea ice would all be melted. Well, 10 years later, 95% of the polar sea ice was melted last summer. Now, today they're telling us that in 10 years, by the end of the century, sea levels will rise a meter. Well, maybe in 10 years, the sea levels are going to rise a meter. Because everything they're saying that's going to happen by the end of the century is happening within 10 years. And it's going to be major climate disaster. It's going to be hammering the rest of the world. And what Eritrea is doing is sort of a role model. I mean, we're conserving water in a massive way so that we're not dependent upon, droughts aren't going to destroy our society. I mean, can you imagine a country like the United States where 2 years in a row, all the rain-fed agriculture in the country failed? If that happened to the U.S. or Europe or these other countries, there'd be huge fallout, economic fallout.
Yeah, there'd be riots in the streets.
Yeah, and these are rich countries, and we're a poor country, and we're having to survive all this. And this is what's going to be happening. I mean, it's just no denying it. It's happening a lot faster than the climatologists are willing to say, because they know if they say it, what they really believe, they're going to see their funding cut off. So, but even then they're starting to say it. We're facing a major methane burp of 50 gigatons, which is, methane is like 80 times worse for global warming than
carbon
CO2.
dioxide,
So when all these when these big methane burps happen and that we see spikes in global temperatures and major climate disaster, what Eritrea has been facing, the Horn of Africa has been facing for decades, is going to come into everybody's front yard. And what we're doing here is people should be paying attention, because water conservation, reforestation, soil conservation, these are things that everybody's going to have to do, and do it at a community level internationally if these societies are going to survive. So one way I'm kind of glad I'm living in Eritrea, because when these, being a socialist country, the government's going to look after the people first. And so the people's interests come first. It's not the interests of the rich or whatever come first, So, we're going to survive. I don't know about the Western countries, so.
Tom, this has been a terrific interview. Before we head out, what is it like? I mean, just daily life. I guess you live in the capital, Asmara. Do you like living there? What languages do they speak? I mean, would you recommend people to come and try to live there and work there? Is there potential for people to work there and live there? If they are
well, right now the government's still struggling to take care of Eritreans first. So, even the Eritreans outside are needed to be able to the kind of government kind of wants them to stay outside and help fund the country's development with their contributions from outside. So, people are welcome to visit here. We're not a four-star destination, but, personally, I live in Asmara, which is up about 2,500 meters.
Oh, wow.
And so it's nice and cool. It's, sunny in the daytime. It's cool at night. The weather's really nice. This time of year, the coast, Red Sea coast, is pretty hot, so we have a house down there. We close up. I've been involved in trying to develop a sustainable fishing industry on the Red Sea. One of the last places in the world that still there's wild fish that are abundant because the government protects the resource. And we've got tremendous aquaculture potential here. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done here, but once the hot weather passes, by the end of September, we go down to the coast and spend a lot of time down there. I'm originally from Honolulu, so I love the ocean, and I go fish and dive and other things. So, but once the hot weather sets in, we close up and move back up into the mountains where it's nice and cool and crisp and sunny. So the climate's really nice, and the people are friendly. It's very safe and secure. Our streets are clean. We don't have homeless people. You don't see homeless here. You don't see beggars here. You don't see, crime is almost unheard of. I can't say there's no crime here, but it's, when somebody gets mugged here, it's like, Asmara is like 500,000 people, and everybody hears about it. Somebody got mugged, it's a big deal. So, on the other hand, it's when you compare it to, I was in the United States over Christmas, and compared to the Western countries, they're rich, and it's, you can't compare it because we're still poor. The life of the people still is hard. The government's struggling to provide basic services like running water to everybody. We don't have 24 hours a day electricity. We average about 16 hours a day. The government is promoting solar power. Like my house is solar power, mainly. So, but when there's no government electricity, we're kind of fortunate because I moved here from the U.S. and I sold my house in Hawaii, so I've lived pretty good. Compared to a lot of Eritreans, my life is pretty idyllic. But for most of the people, life remains hard. It's a struggle. Salaries are small. The government is trying to spend its money rather than on salaries and making people's lifestyles extravagant. They want to see the villages develop. They want to see, prepare for these climate disasters that keep hammering us. Every year we don't know whether there's going to be a drought again. So, the government's got to stockpile food. They've got to stockpile water resources. They've got a lot of infrastructure that was left over from the Italian times 50, 60 years ago that are pretty old and, need to be replaced. And so the government's got a lot of challenges, and it's not easy here. It's like Cuba. There's a lot of challenges. People.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, we've got free education. We've got free medical care, So, there's a trade-off. So, in any case, people should keep, I tell people don't believe anything you hear and almost nothing you read about what they say about Eritrea. It's not true.
Yeah.
I've been here 10 years. I'm an independent journalist. I have no connection to the government, and I don't, I just tell it like it is. I don't try to pretend everything's perfect, but on the other hand, I focus on the positive things, so.
Yeah.
So, listen, it's been good to talk to you. My battery on my phone here is about kaput, so.
Well, listen, Tom.
Cut off again.
This has been a wonderful interview. I'll have it up in a little bit, and hopefully you can, by tomorrow, and hopefully you can share it with everybody that in Africa. I've learned a lot. I know our listeners are going to learn a lot, and it sounds like Eritrea is a really inspiring and hopeful country. And thank you so much for telling us the truth about Eritrea and not all the Western propaganda coming out of the Department of State in Brussels at the European Commission.